Good morning. I'm from a preaching tradition where the congregation fully participates, meaning the congregation talks back to the pastor. So feel free if you feel so inclined. But will you pray with me? Spirit of the living God, fall afresh on me. Bless the words that flow from my mouth, and bless the hearing of these words by your people. Amen. So this past week, I had the opportunity to represent our association, the Southern Association of the Southern California Nevada Conference, at this year's General Synod in Baltimore, Maryland. How many of us have been to Synod before? Quite a few. For those of us who have not, Synod is a fantastic opportunity to witness the diversity of our church. Synod is attended by both delegates like myself and visitors, and it's attended by both lay people and clergy people, and there is a huge representation of youth and young adults who attend Synod for their voices to be heard and for their voices to be counted, and who wish to contribute their stories and ideas to our United Church of Christ. During each Synod, delegates are asked to vote on varying resolutions. Some of the resolutions voted on proudly passed with little to no debate, such as affirming boldly and without hesitation that the United Church of Christ is an immigrant-welcoming church, or that the United Church of Christ declares its commitment to disability justice. Those resolutions passed. Other resolutions proved to be more difficult for our united and uniting church to find common ground, such as the church supporting legislation authorizing aid in dying for terminally ill patients, or supporting legislation for adult adoptees to acquire their original birth certificates. Those didn't pass. But no matter what the topic on the Synod floor, delegates from across the country had the opportunity to share their thoughts on the varying issues. That is until, during the presentation of one resolution entitled, quote, "On Recognizing and Studying Gun Violence as a Public Health Emergency," end quote, 4 Black youth delegates were denied the opportunity to speak. Let me share with you what happened. The resolution was presented to the floor. The majority of those speaking stood for the resolution to pass. The youth collectively stood up to share their hopes for the passing of the resolution because, as it turns out, these were 4 Black high school students from the city of Chicago. In the year 2015, Chicago recorded 478 homicides, more than any other American city. 93% of people killed in Chicago that year were shot to death. So needless to say, those youth, those 4 Black teens from Chicago, just wanted to tell their stories about gun violence as it pertained to the resolution. They were denied the opportunity to speak because, thinking that there was no debate to be had, thinking that all who were standing up waiting to speak were simply for the resolution, a man approached the microphone and called the question, meaning he asked for the end of conversation on the topic so that the delegates can go ahead and vote on the resolution. This occurred right when those 4 teens were up next to speak. The delegation ended up voting to pass the resolution, recognizing gun violence as a public health emergency, but they did so without affording these young people with the opportunity to tell their stories. From where I sat, I noticed what was happening. I noticed that these young people were distraught and disappointed by their inability to share their stories in that public space. So I approached them. I shared with them how proud I was for them to be willing to stand up in front of almost 3,000 people, and how sorry I was that they were unable to speak. One of them burst out into tears. All she wanted was to share the story, her story, of young Black teenagers from Chicago and how they were dying to gun violence. So I feel as though it's my duty, my obligation to bring their story with me to wherever I go. But first, the text. Our text for this morning takes us to a particular point in the history of our faith. We often understand the God we worship to be the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and so we now get to witness the story of Jacob, the story of our forefather who became patriarch to a great nation. But what if we look at this from the perspective of those who don't really get to speak, those who have someone call the question before it's their turn to approach the microphone? What if we look at this story from the perspective of Esau? In the text, we learn that Esau was Isaac's favorite child. How many of us know what it's like to be the favorite child? But Esau was Isaac's favorite. In verse 27, we read, "When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, while Jacob was a quiet man living in tents." Verse 28, "Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game, but Rebekah loved Jacob." These verses foreshadow a moment later in Genesis where Jacob and Rebekah worked together to secure Jacob's position in history. But in Genesis 25, we learn the birth story of Jacob and why some Hebrew and biblical scholars understand Jacob's name to be translated to "he deceives." So Jacob and Esau are born as twins, and we fast forward to a hot Mediterranean day when Esau goes out to hunt. Hunting is what Esau loves. It's what he knows. It's what makes him him and how he is connected to his father and community. We know Esau is a hunter, and he's also described as hairy, even described as the color red. And to the ancient Israelite, Esau's hunting, like his hairiness, like his complexion, suggested an uncouthness and even a certain degree of danger. Imagine a large, muscular, hairy, dark-complected hunter. Interesting how his dark male body leads others to make negative assumptions about him. Let that sink in. But Esau goes out to do what he does and what he knows, and he goes out to hunt. And when he comes home, he approaches his brother, who is casually stirring an aromatic stew. I imagine Jacob teasing his hungry brother, wafting the aroma of lentils and spices towards Esau. When the irresistible aroma met Esau's nostrils, he immediately began to salivate and requested a bowl for his own. But Jacob, the deceiver, recognized this as his time to shine. This was the perfect opportunity for him to get what he wanted out of his famished and tired brother. This was his opportunity to get Esau's birthright. "First, sell me your birthright," says Jacob, I'm sure with a smug grin on his face. You see, a birthright is the privilege given to the firstborn son, which in this case was Esau. A birthright means privilege, a birthright means authority, a birthright means respect, a birthright means security, opportunity, a legacy. Birthrights for Israelite families were so critically important. So when Esau freely gave into Jacob's loaded request, it was like a jaw-dropping moment. Why in the world would Esau do such a silly thing? Well, he tells us in verse 32. Esau says, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?" Esau's reasoning was not so much pertaining to that particular moment of hunger. He wasn't suggesting that he was about to die at that moment due to the hunger he felt at that particular time. No. Esau was referring to his risky and dangerous life as a hunter. He felt this lifestyle that he knew and grew accustomed to was one day going to kill him. He had no use for a birthright, for he felt like he was going to die a young man anyway. Church, we can move from thinking about this story as the ascension of Jacob to the throne of patriarchy to the story of a hopeless young man who felt he had nothing to live for. A hopeless young man caught up in the dangers of his lifestyle. This story of Esau permeates my heart much like the story shared by the black teens from Chicago at Synod, or much like the youth of Baltimore, the city that hosted General Synod, who follow Chicago as the third highest number of homicides with 344 deaths in 2015 alone. Or Milwaukee, the city hosting our next General Synod in 2019, which has the 10th highest murder rate in the country and is home to the most incarcerated zip code in America. And due to systemic injustices throughout the history of our country, we have learned that our brown and black youth succumb to a culture of violence and imprisonment because this is what they know. Because this connects them to others in their communities. And perhaps how Leslie McSpadden puts it as she grieves the murder of her son, Michael Brown, she says, "Do you know how many black men graduate? Not many. Because you bring them down to this type of level where they feel like they don't got nothing to live for anyway." Chicago, Baltimore, Milwaukee, these are cities filled with Esaus. These are young, dark men whose risky lifestyles lead them to have no hope for their futures, leading them to sell their birthrights, leading them to give up their power, their authority, their hopes, their dreams, their security, their opportunities, because much like Esau, they believe, I am going to die a young man anyway. What is the use? And we have Jacobs, taking on the form of systemic injustices, deceivingly whispering into the spirits of Esaus, telling them to sell out, telling them to give up, telling them to throw away what is rightfully theirs. The 4 black youth at Synod just wanted to tell us about the Esaus they knew. One wanted to tell us about his own brother who got shot in the head. One wanted to tell us about her close friend who was murdered just a day before Synod. And they also wanted to be testaments to young black teenagers in this country who did not sell their birthrights, who recognized that their lives mattered, that their voices mattered, and that their participation in the church mattered. But the spirit of Jacob took a hold of the Synod floor, and the youth were denied a chance to speak. Where do you see Esaus in your midst? When do you feel like an Esau? Feel like all that you have going on may just not be worth it? Or better yet, when do you feel like a Jacob? When do you feel like you're robbing others of their privilege as an attempt to secure your own? When do you feel like you are the one calling the question, asserting your voice over others, rendering them as unheard, leaving them voiceless? Church, the Spirit of the living God compels us to pay attention to the Esaus. The Spirit of the living God compels us to reject the deceiving spirit of Jacob and boldly declare to the Esaus around us that they matter, that they must hold on to their birthrights, to what is rightfully theirs, that they must never give up on their hopes, their dreams, their power, and that it will be worth it, that they don't have to die young. May we pay attention to the Esaus, for this is his story. Amen.